Picture this. It's the sweltering summer of 1518, and you're walking down an empty cobblestone street in the city of Strasbourg, right in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. What happened on those very streets over 5 centuries ago is honestly one of the most bizarre, chilling historical cold cases on record. We're talking about an event that completely defies simple logic, where ordinary people were seemingly hijacked by some invisible force, compelled to push their bodies to the absolute breaking point. So today, in this explainer, we are diving deep into this mystery. We're going to sift through the historical evidence, the biological theories, and the wild psychological realities to figure out exactly what triggered the infamous dancing plague.
Our mystery kicks off with a single resident, a woman named Frau Troffa. According to historical records, she just stepped out into the street one day and began to dance. But here's the catch. There was absolutely no music playing. There was no festival going on. And most disturbingly, she couldn't seem to stop. She was reportedly suffering from a profound psychological breakdown, her body moving completely out of her control in the summer heat. Just imagine being a confused townsperson gathering around to watch this lone woman twisting and stepping for hours on end. It wasn't a performance, It was a compulsion.
And the craziest part is, it didn't just stop with her. What started on day one with Frau Troffa all by herself quickly escalated into a terrifying contagion. Literally 1 week later, dozens of other townspeople had joined her in the streets, mirroring those exact same uncontrollable movements. Fast forward a few more weeks, and historical records tell us that hundreds of people were reportedly caught in this bizarre trance. Now, historians do still debate the exact number of participants today, but the rapid, undeniable spread of this thing is well documented. It went from one isolated incident to a full-blown crisis in a matter of days.
Which brings us to the core question of our entire investigation. What could possibly make an entire crowd completely lose control of its own movements? We are not talking about people just getting a little too carried away at a party. We're talking about hundreds of individuals abandoning their lives, their families, and their basic survival instincts to do this exhausting physical exertion for weeks on end. I mean, what kind of environmental, biological, or psychological forces are actually powerful enough to hijack an entire community's bodies like that?
Well, for a long time, people have pointed the finger at one major suspect, the ergot theory. It's a really tidy biological scapegoat. Ergot is this toxic fungus that grows on damp rye, which, by the way, was the main grain used for baking bread back in 1518. And the fascinating thing about ergot is that its chemical compounds are actually closely related to the substances used to develop LSD. So the theory basically goes that the whole town accidentally ate some bad bread and went on a massive community-wide hallucination. It's a comforting thought, right? That a simple chemical accident caused all this, rather than something much darker lurking inside the human mind?
But let's look a little closer at that, because the biological logic falls apart pretty fast. When we actually compare the known medical effects of ergot poisoning with the historical descriptions of the outbreak, the reality just doesn't match up. Ergotism is absolutely brutal. It causes things like gangrenous decay, literally restricting blood flow until your limbs rot, and intense convulsive seizures. Sufferers are in sheer, writhing agony. That is vastly different from the coordinated rhythmic movements and superhuman endurance you need to run a month-long dancing marathon. Put simply, poisoned, agonizing people absolutely cannot perform athletic endurance events for weeks.
So because the physical and pharmacological evidence just completely contradicts the historical descriptions, we really have to recognize the limits of that idea. Today, the ergot theory is highly disputed by modern medical historians. It's basically an incomplete explanation. Sure, it sounds great in pop culture, but it ignores the brutal physical realities of the poisoning, and it fails to explain the prolonged, socially spreading behavior they saw in Strasbourg. To find the real cause, we can't just look for some toxin in the grain. We have to look way beyond biology and examine the incredibly pressurized environment these people were actually living in.
Because Strasbourg in 1518 was an absolute pressure cooker of human misery. I mean, the population was just getting battered by a storm of ongoing disasters. We're talking catastrophic crop failures leading to severe famines. Extreme, widespread poverty was just everyday life. Add to that virulent, deadly outbreaks of smallpox and these devastating waves of syphilis ravaging the town. These people were living under extraordinary pressure, totally surrounded by death, hunger, and this intense, suffocating social anxiety. They were exhausted, they were terrified, and they were desperate.
And layered on top of all that catastrophic daily stress was a very specific, very potent cultural superstition. The local population had this deeply ingrained, intense religious fear of Saint Vitus. In their belief system, Saint Vitus was a Christian saint who had the power to punish sinners by cursing them, specifically by forcing them to dance uncontrollably. Now that is not just a random piece of trivia. That cultural conditioning is the exact psychological trigger needed for this bizarre phenomenon. Their minds were already pushed to the absolute brink by disease and starvation, and they were deeply primed to fear this exact type of supernatural punishment.
This unique, devastating combination of extreme trauma and cultural conditioning leads us straight to the research of medical historian John Waller. He calls the whole event a textbook case of mass psychogenic illness. Waller's research fundamentally shifts our focus away from that comforting myth of poisoned bread and points us toward a much more complex and, frankly, far more unsettling explanation about our own psychology. The grim conditions in Strasbourg created the absolute perfect storm for the human mind to just buckle under the weight of its own despair.
So let's unpack exactly what that means. Mass psychogenic illness, which is often called mass hysteria, does not mean people are just faking it. These are genuine, very real physical symptoms that spread rapidly through a crowd, driven entirely by extreme psychological stress, intense expectation, and profound social influence. So when Frau Trophäa began her trance, driven by her own breakdown, the collective trauma of the community watching her, combined with their shared fear of St. Vitus, created a highly contagious psychological state. The stress literally manifested physically. It spread from person to person like a virus of the mind.
And hey, if we needed any more proof that this was a socially influenced psychological event rather than a biological one, just look at what the local government did. It is wild. First, the city council diagnosed the outbreak as an affliction of hot blood. Their medical logic actually dictated that the victims just needed to, well, dance it out of their systems. So, in a spectacular backfire, they built wooden stages right in the public squares. They even hired professional musicians to play along. Instead of stopping it, they inadvertently provided a highly visible, sanctioned space that reinforced the psychological trance. It was a well-intentioned cure that tragically made the plague exponentially worse.
So, as we wrap up the evidence for this explainer, where does that leave us? On one hand, ergot-poisoning claims it was accidental ingestion, but the reality is that the grueling physical symptoms completely contradict the superhuman endurance they saw in 1518. On the other hand, mass psychogenic illness relies on stress-driven social contagion, and this absolutely stands as the leading, evidence-based theory heavily supported by the undeniable trauma and cultural beliefs of that specific era. Now, obviously, it's been over 5 centuries, so the exact, definitive cause will probably always remain a bit uncertain. History rarely gives us a perfectly tied bow.
But the one thing we do know for absolute certain is that the dancing plague of 1518 proves human minds can experience a profound collective breakdown under immense societal pressure, warping the physical body far more brutally than any food toxin ever could. And honestly, that leaves us with one incredibly haunting question to ponder long after this explainer ends. If belief, fear, and extreme trauma could push the human body this far back in 1518, how much control does your mind truly have over you today? Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive, and keep questioning the limits of the human mind.